Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, AI and Human Flourishing, a pipe dream? Please welcome Jake Denton, Research Associate in the Heritage Foundation's Tech Policy Center.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name's Jake Denton. I'm a research associate here in the Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation. We're very happy that you're all joining us here for what will almost certainly be one of many AI events that we have over the next several years. And we thought it would be fitting to get this rolling, what will naturally become a series of events, with some background information, things that will help navigate this conversation so that you're able to follow along regardless of your familiarity with the topic. And so naturally, I think it makes sense to start with AI itself. You turn on the TV today and it seems like everything under the sun is artificial intelligence, and it can make it very difficult to place a definition on it. And oftentimes here in Washington, you'll see that there are a million different definitions for AI. So just to put it in a very simple context, when we talk about AI, we're referring to computer systems that can perform tasks which typically require human intelligence, such as voice recognition, complex problem solving, or just decision making. These are things that typically couldn't be automated without these types of systems. And so while it may seem like AI is a new thing, it has found its way into many aspects of our daily lives, whether it be product recommendations or in entertainment systems such as Netflix or Spotify recommending you a new movie or a song. And so the recent evolutions have made it feel like it's some sci-fi technology, but it's really been around for quite a bit of time, and you've used it in your daily lives. Another term you might hear today is machine learning, or ML. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence that enables these computational systems to learn patterns from data and make decisions or predictions without being explicitly programmed to perform the task. And so this is kind of that passive learning element. Oftentimes when you hear these machines are evolving or they're getting out of control, they're kind of referring to the sci-fi offset of this machine learning concept. And it's much more kind of standard. It's less kind of scary than, TV would make you believe. It's really just the way that these systems evolve and become better over time. Machine learning also enables these systems to improve their performance on a specific task over time as they're exposed to the new information, whether that be a new data set or the inputs the user is using for that system. You might also hear our speakers today mention large language models. A large language model, or LLM, is a type of artificial intelligence that uses deep learning and massive data sets to understand, summarize, generate, and predict text-based content, such as language translations, chatbots, and AI assistants. Large language models use neural networks to understand and generate human-like text. Neural networks are inspired by the human brain and work by processing input text through multiple layers of interconnected nodes, similar to neurons. This allows them to capture meaning and context of the input text and generate a relevant response. These typically run with deep neural networks, which are sophisticated machine learning models that leverage multiple layers of interconnected nodes and process and learn from data. It is particularly effective in capturing complex patterns and relationships with said data. Many of these deep neural networks or large language models run with black boxes. And so these are often very complex and opaque internal structures. And the term refers to an AI system whose decision-making is obscured behind a kind of complex black box, making it very difficult to comprehend or interpret the particular decision path. And so within these models, the data and computations are distributed across a vast network of interconnected nodes. And it makes it hard to trace back the decision-making process. And so what we refer to when we talk about explainable AI is kind of lifting that black box. And that is something that will naturally be part of the conversation today. We're going to try and present a path forward that is more transparent, it's easier to trace, it's more consumer-friendly and more governance-friendly. It's something that is going to make these systems integrate in a more seamless fashion without that kind of shadowy lore around the system. It makes it more comfortable for us to integrate these. And so, as I was mentioning, this opacity can lead to concerns related to trust, interpretability, and the potential for bias or harmful outputs. And so a large focus here at the Heritage Foundation and a lot of centers around DC is how we can facilitate explainable AI. And I believe we'll get into it in much greater detail today, but when we talk about explainable AI, as I was mentioning, it really all stems around lifting that black box. And it can take place in many different forms, whether it be global or local. And all that really means in practice is the extent to which the data is revealed. So for a global system, it's truly the full process of learning, whether from the data set to the output, it'll make everything transparent. For a local explainable model, it really just gives you some additional context. It will explain to you why a particular decision made the most sense in that output, but it won't give you insights to the full data set. You might have seen this if you're using the AI tools with Claude, Anthropic's model. It's begun to explain, if you ask it to make text better, why it's made a particular decision. So this is something that is beginning to make itself available on the market. And so that essentially will wrap up our key terms. And it was obviously a very quick overview, but it's hopefully a blueprint and a map that will guide you through this conversation and help you make sense of what we talk about today. And so we have gathered a great panel of experts, and they're representing a very diverse span of different policy issues under AI, from protecting kids online to combating the Chinese Communist Party's influence within these systems. And so I'll now welcome our panelists, John Askinas, David Dunmeyer, Bill Drexel, Kara Frederick, and Matt Stoller, and Wes Hodges, who's moderating today's program. So I'll head things over to Wes, and we'll get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Jake. All right. And we even have the right order. Terrific. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Jake, thank you for that very, very needed introduction to AI, so we can jump from the terms straight into the policy. As we've discussed, artificial intelligence is poised to transform our country. While we expect AI to enhance productivity, widespread adoption could also threaten many pillars of society we take for granted. I'm Wes. I have the privilege of being the lead for the Big Tech campaign here at Heritage and the moderator for this wonderful panel. I will introduce and interview our speakers sequentially, but there is something you all can do to help me with this program. After their remarks, we want to hear your questions, with one condition. You must have a question mark at the end of your question. So with that, let's just get right to it. So our first speaker is my friend John Askinas. John is a senior fellow with the Foundation for American Innovation. He is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, where he works on the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. I've asked John to speak on children and AI, so let's kick it off. My first question for you, John. AI technology allows seemingly innocuous tools like deepfakes to generate child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, from either real or imaginary children. We have already seen reports of this behavior among children in our schools. How would you recommend policymakers deal with this debacle? How do you prevent the abuse of CSAM, creation and distribution in an AI world?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Wes, and I think it's a really important panel and discussion for us to be having, the whole panel, of course. So I was thinking, reflecting this morning, that I think one of the things that's interesting about the policy debate about AI is it's forcing us to confront problems that actually come from the internet era. They're actually ubiquitous across the internet era, but we were attacking them with methods which I think were ultimately doomed to fail, but now are obviously non-starters in an AI era. So to separate your question a little bit into two parts, one of which is the use by children of generative AI systems, including image generation systems, and the second, which I think is totally separate almost, which is the intentional usage by adults of these systems to create child sexual abuse material. The reality is our approach to CSAM Online is not working. It has not been working. We use the most sophisticated detection tools that it seems possible to invent, and yet every year the FBI records greater and greater numbers of material that's confiscated, prosecutions of people sharing this stuff with no end in sight, really. And that's with a system which, if applied to any area of content other than CSAM, would be recognized as totalitarian in its implications. And I'm not attacking. I think it's justified in this case. But this is the strongest, most robust case of public-private partnership between all the major platform providers and the FBI, with massive data sets of captured images, searching every mechanism we can imagine. And now it's obvious that this approach, which was already failing, will not work for images which are generated sort of de novo, either locally or on a platform, AI image generation platform. I think there's a couple of things we need to consider. One, there's the spiritual dimension, which we've been reluctant to focus. Why is it that so many people want to generate these images? What about our society is creating people, is misforming people to create this kind of desire, right? This is not a normal, natural human desire. I mean, maybe in a very small fraction of the population, it's something that comes from abuse when they're young, or from something in their nature. But for most people, I think this is a product of already being deformed by internet pornography, by not of the CSAM variety, of the other variety. So I think this is a problem which can't be addressed without thinking about the sort of demand source. And the other thing is our legal system, our legal structure around CSAM right now rests on the sort of the thread that even sort of consuming CSAM, which you didn't generate, creates a market for it, which harms children. The existence of the market for it harms children, and this justifies our laws against child pornography, right? This obviously will fall legally with AI-generated child pornography, and so we need to return to a more robust theory of obscenity in our legal code and in our jurisprudence. So I think, to my mind, this is a problem which does not have a technological solution, right? It has spiritual and legal and cultural solutions, but not technological ones. And that was already the case before image generation.
So there's not a quick fix?
There's not a quick fix,
Okay,
no.
okay. Glad I asked. Well, then, my next question for you. Meta has championed one dystopian manifestation of AI through creating chatbot character personalities of celebrities with child audiences. Maybe some of you have seen advertisements for this. Could you walk us through the social damage you anticipate, or don't, of AI companies encouraging relationships with animated chatbots? What does this do to children? In my mind, I refer back to that movie, Her, but imagine that with children. So what are your thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting, very interesting question, and not to defend Meta, but they're hardly the only or most sophisticated company that's making these kinds of systems, right? They're going to be ubiquitous, these kind of AI agents of different characteristics, including chatbots that are very convincing, very compelling, that you can have a kind of relationship with. And unfortunately, right, it's interesting you bring up Her, because of course that's a movie about the spiritual damage of loneliness to an adult, right? The primary market for these is not going to be children, it's going to be adults. And I think that, again, I think we need to have a framework and actually enforce our framework for giving parents control over the tools that their children use. I think in the internet era, there was sort of a fig leaf of an attempt to do this, but it was never actually substantively enforced. It was never substantively integrated in app stores and other, all the responsibility for parental controls was put on parents. And the defaults were not, in many cases, were not set up to preemptively force parents to allow their kids to do things, rather than giving them the ability to, after the fact, restrict their kids' use of platforms or devices. So I think we need to get that right this time. But again, I think that the real problem here is, obviously, the world that our children will grow up in is one in which they will learn very quickly that there are these systems which talk like people, respond like people, but aren't people. I think the bigger danger is that we build a society in which human flourishing disappears, a society in which we, for purposes of economic efficiency, we already are doing this, of course. One of the main, I think, potential markets for these kinds of chatbots is not for children, it's for the elderly who suffer loneliness at very high rates. So let's just give them a chatbot to make them less lonely. I mean, these are very dystopian things, but I think they have less to do with children and more to do with the general shape of our society.
Well, this panel is not getting any less scary. My last question for you is, going to the 50,000-foot view, Is child protection supported or severed by rapid AI acceleration? Can good AI effectively counter bad AI? Would children be safer in a tightly managed AI interface to the internet?
I mean, I think it's an important question. I mean, it's actually like 5 or 6 different questions put together. So I'll choose the one I want to answer. I think that look, AI is a technology at least as powerful as the internet, which is we've scarcely begun to digest the implications of the internet. And now we have this technology which operates very differently from the internet, but is nonetheless equally powerful. So you could replace AI in that sense with the internet. You'd have a sense of kind of the scale of it, right? I think the important thing for children will be focusing on children. Again, I think the second order implications of AI are more important than the obvious first order ones. The second order implication of AI is that it becomes a lot easier to build systems without human involvement. And unless we're willing to defend humanity, not on terms of pure efficiency, but on terms of truth, goodness, and beauty, in terms of the kind of sympathy and being with that makes us human. Unless we're willing to defend it on those terms, it will always lose to the AI. The AI is going to be smarter. It's going to be more scalable. It's going to be cheaper. So I think we need to think very seriously about what it means to be human. I mean, I think that is the question that AI poses to us.
Efficiency and the good life. Those are good things to think on. John, we'll get back to you when we get to Q&A, but thank you so much. Next in our lineup is Bill Drexel. Bill is an Associate Fellow for Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. His work focuses on the risks of artificial intelligence applications in national defense. Previously, he conducted investigative research in the surveillance state of Xinjiang, China, worked as an internal displacement data officer at the UN Migration, and researched technology competition at the American Enterprise Institute. Bill, Heritage takes the CCP threat seriously, and we're grateful that you are here to discuss the nexus of AI and our foreign adversary. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
My first question for you is a little broad. What would losing to China in global AI dominance mean for the United States?
Yeah, that's a large question. And at the risk of sounding dramatic when I hear it, I think of some words from Churchill when he said, if we fail, we run the risk of, quote, sinking into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. There's a lot there to unpack, but I think that we're talking about what may be the most consequential technology since the internet, maybe since nuclear fission, maybe since the printing press. And if there is a genocidal dictatorship at the helm of that new technology, that's a very fundamental threat to human flourishing, to the future of humanity in general. Particular elements of AI technology make that the case. One is that AI, to a degree that's not exactly true of other technology, can be encoded with values. It's often a decision-making tool. And if those values are guided by a totalitarian mindset and exported around the world, we're looking at a very different world, right? I think particularly of 3 domains that I'm especially worried about where a future of CCP-led AI could be catastrophic for humanity. One is the future of war and violence. So to a degree that's not been possible before, we have the potential down the line for killer robots that will be calling shots. A second area is the future of governance. So we're going to talk about censorship shortly, so I won't dwell on that, but there's a huge potential for surveillance, censorship, totally unprecedented forms of brainwashing that the CCP could leverage. And a third and underappreciated area that I think doesn't get a lot of airtime is the future of human biology. So we've had debates about bioethics and genetic engineering for decades, but those debates have largely been speculative in nature. AI, for the first time, is unlocking the potential for precision human genetic engineering. And the CCP has already indicated that it is likely to explore those possibilities much more thoroughly and with a lot more reckless abandon than other nations would. So you put that all together, and you're looking at futures that could really be dystopian in a number of ways.
Well, Bill, you know your audience well. If you could respond to every question with a Churchill quote, passing grade. But you mentioned values baked into the technology. We have a tendency to view tech as neutral. I'm curious what you think it means for tech to be hardwired for autocratic control, like what China is doing with AI, and what does it mean to be hardwired for, say, peace and prosperity, a U.S. version of AI? What does it mean to bake values in this format?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's one that we'll be answering for the next couple decades. For one thing, I think a challenge we face in fighting the CCP threat is that it's often more difficult to empower than it is to oppress. And so if your goal is to oppress, AI lends itself in a number of ways to kind of achieving that goal. So I would say that the kind of pinnacle of oppressive AI that we've seen so far is in Xinjiang, where I spent a little bit of time. The Xinjiang model has kind of, you can look at it architecturally. So a city that is kind of the historical cultural home of the Uyghur population was once arranged around mosques where they radiated out. There would be a mosque, and then you'd have a neighborhood that radiates out from that mosque. And then once you kind of hit a critical mass of population, a new mosque would be planted and it would radiate out. They've raised the city and installed a grid of surveillance nodes, kind of surveillance police stations, and then arranged the homes around those surveillance nodes. The nodes are meant to track everything. They're meant to track your electricity usage, your water usage. Are you doing the prescribed cultural activities that have been sanctioned by the state? Are you doing any cultural activities that are not sanctioned by the state? Do you go to the flag raising ceremony every Monday morning? You have facial recognition cameras that have been designed by several Chinese companies to recognize the faces of this ethnic minority for particular attention as opposed to the ethnic Han majority. And then finally, you've actually got AI tools that will track, interpret, understand, and translate the Uyghur language for analysis by the ethnic Chinese rulers to, at scale, detect if there's any thought or planning that goes against the state. So you can see already where that's headed there. I think something that's more freedom affirming would be finding ways to set boundaries on these technologies and using them in more decentralized ways, and even potentially some kind of AI systems pointed at each other. Can you detect when governments are going out of line in abusing their powers, or when companies are doing the same? You need to have kind of these, you basically want to stop it from being a centralized node looking down on a population into a more variated kind of separation of powers. I think perhaps with some inspiration from our founding documents.
Well, I love that answer. I think I have time for one more quick question for you. Would you mind just catching us up on what China has been doing to lead on AI?
Sure. So the US and China, our approaches to AI more or less reflect our societies. China's kind of authoritarian ambitions has meant that it's developed an ecosystem that's really good at authoritarian versions of AI. So that's image recognition, facial recognition, various forms of kind of tracking individuals and analyzing their kind of activities. They've been focusing on addressing practical issues in law enforcement and other kind of issues, logistics, et cetera. And they've been pumping this out around the world, particularly to developing economies and to nations that are either partially free or not free. So while the US has been spending a lot of time in diplomatic engagement trying to kind of set the rules of the road for AI, China has been focusing on just building the road around the world, building the digital Silk Road, as it were, and is de facto gaining influence and setting norms just by making facts on the ground.
Our third speaker today from the great state of Texas.
David Dunbar. Better Tech for Tomorrow. He has been with
Thank you. Where he worked issues ranging from transportation to technology. David, I have some questions on AI surveillance and data privacy, if you're ready for them.
Absolutely.
Terrific. Well, hey, my first question for you is we tend to treat data cheaply. We trading an unlimited personal supply for easy access to online digital platforms. What do you think the gold U.S. standard for data privacy should be? And please share why that matters with the proliferation of AI.
Yeah, well, first, Wes, Heritage Foundation, thank you for hosting this discussion today. I want to kind of bring this back a little bit to the social media age to then translate into what we're seeing today with AI. And I know Kara spent some time working at Facebook, the belly of the beast, and I think they provide an interesting kind of case study for what we're seeing today with Gen AI systems and really the consumer-company relationship. So as you all recall, Facebook begins with the espoused mission of connecting people digitally as they continue to advance and develop, realizing we need a steady supply of revenue, and personal information fit that bill perfectly. And it was ultimately the hiring of staff on Facebook, finding a way to mechanize this system to produce what is now considered to be the new oil, the new digital gold, so to speak, our personal information. And so as time progressed and Facebook kind of drifted away from that mission, if they had it to begin with, and turned it more into how do we get as many eyeballs on the screen for as long as humanly possible so we can collect more and more information. And as they became more efficient with the provision of their service, they got more efficient with collecting more and more granular information. And so that's kind of the mission drift, the move fast and break things philosophy that really defined the social media era and insert any company. And I think we can draw interesting parallels with the recent corporate governance issue with OpenAI, right? Where the board initially had concern with Sam Altman that he lost sight of the vision of promoting AI that elevates humanity, ultimately ousting him over concerns that commercialization was subsuming that goal of advancing those responsible AI systems. And to your point, Wes, you talk about how we, the consumer, treat data cheaply. And as I just mentioned, of course, this is the cash cow for these companies. And I think Jake mentioned it in his intro, this opacity that has been built into the model of data collection, right? So it is in the interest of these companies to make it unclear and uncertain as to how much information they're collecting on you, what it's being used for, and how it's being sold and transferred. And so this is really the, I guess, the case study, so to speak, that's important to apply to AI, because now as consumers, to a certain extent, well, on the one hand, we can see 90% of Americans support data privacy reform. That tends not to match up to the actual uses of social media. A lot of folks still are deleting social media accounts. I'll try and be optimistic here. Coming from Texas, I think we can provide some non-feigned hope as to the future of data privacy. And in Texas, I work very closely with lawmaker champions. Thank you. Lawmaker champions, Representative Capriglione in the House and Senator Brian Hughes, and ultimately Governor Greg Abbott, to get past what is considered the strongest data privacy reform in the country. And it's known as the Texas Data Privacy Security Act. And Wes, to your point, I think this is the great step in the right direction for the gold standard we need to work toward in AI. And what it does is it promotes transparency and agency on the part of the consumer. And it's effectively known as a digital bill of rights. And the first and most important step in kind of breaking this model is giving consumers a right to know what information is being collected, because then and only then do we have insight into the black box that is the collection of our personal information? And I'd push back on the folks who say we blindly accept these terms of service, so we agree to it. Well, the point is, again, opacity is the goal. Without that right to know what's being collected, we can't make an informed decision about what we're giving up in exchange for that service. And so the bill goes on and it provides additional rights, such as the ability to delete information companies have, to correct inaccurate information, to opt out of data processing, and ultimately and importantly, the right to not be discriminated against for electing to exercise these rights. The last thing I'd say, because we're in the conservative movement, we operate in radical incrementalism, the shifting of the Overton window. This Texas bill is a great step in the right direction, but as we move toward a hyper-digitalized AI landscape, I think the gold standard really should be an opt-in model. So just think about how backwards it is, coming to a tech company, hat in hand, begging and pleading that they comply with state laws, if you have them, to give your information back, despite their terms of service, despite their privacy policy saying it's your data. And so the opt-in model we need to work toward is companies come to you seeking express affirmative consent for them to collect and process your personal information. So, Wes, I'm encouraged because even Congress fails to act on this. We have tech companies. Microsoft has been pushing for data privacy since 2003. In Texas, I worked very closely with industry folks who recognize there is a crisis of trust with these tech companies. And so they stepped up and they did support state policy. And even absent an ineffective Congress, I think we're seeing states really take a decisive leading decision here.
Well, it's encouraging seeing that surge of flexing state authority and when it comes to these issues. We have a lot to learn from the laboratories of democracy. Connecting data privacy concerns with AI. As AI technologies advance, the granularity of personal data that heard from seemingly innocuous information increases. An example I can think of is tech firms being able to figure out that a mother is policy measures can be implemented to address the ethical implications of these predictive analytics, especially when it comes to sensitive areas such as employment, insurance, finance, or discriminatory outcomes, and how do we protect individuals from unwarranted biases?
Well, I remember when I first started looking at data privacy was, I think it was 2006 or 2007, the penultimate example was the gal whose father was receiving coupons for diapers and other baby products because Target knew before her own parents did that she was pregnant. And that was more than a decade ago, and we've seen just leaps and bounds in predictive analytics to your specific question, which is really just using statistics and AI-driven statistical software to predict outcomes. And some of the things that I've looked at, just to highlight where we're at right now and what we can do policy-wise, is take the automobile sector, which is becoming increasingly digitalized. It's not just larger infotainment screens in your Teslas, but it's sensors, scanners, video cameras. If you have level 3 or self-driving, level 3 capabilities for lane assist, all that is great, but it also means new vectors for collecting information. So to the insurance question, these automobile manufacturers are selling that information to insurance companies. How long does it take for you to stop at a stop sign? What's your reaction time at a stoplight? Or perhaps what time of day are you driving at? And there's a risk and concern of unwarranted biases, whereupon those are all considered to be risk profile elements. So if there's a mother who, let's say, is working during the day, school at night, and drives home later, and that's her weekly routine, well, she might get hit with a higher premium because of that late night drive associated with either drunk driving or other less upstanding activities. At the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we have a child welfare center. And I was talking with our policy director last week about how CPS and other groups are using predictive analytics to determine the likelihood that an incident, so again, before it even happens, the likelihood that an incident will occur, whereupon CPS needs to remove that child. And it's already informing actions. And there's at least 5 examples I've seen at this point where families with special needs are considered to meet that quote-unquote quota to justify the removal of that child. So we're talking about indelible, irreparable decisions that could forever harm that child's life and that family's life. And so to be optimistic now, in Texas, we worked on what's called the Artificial Intelligence Advisory Council. And I know many states have followed suit. And we're seeing even congressional national level tend to follow this model here, which does 2 really important things. And one that Texas did, I think, really well in particular. One is it acknowledges that states have been using predictive analytics for years, and that taxpayers, when state agencies are using it, taxpayers don't know how it's affecting the services that are being provided and how it's being used. And so the first step is to take a full inventory. How are we using this? How is it affecting the taxpayer? And what's that interaction relationship? The second is it creates an AI advisory council, so a panel of experts, software engineers, digital ethicists, constitutional lawyers, and so on, to host fora to discuss the various applications of predictive analytics and AI. And what you're seeing so far is a more concerted approach. I think three major principles that, at least at TBPF, we advocate for with predictive analytics and AI, and that's transparency. So I mentioned the inventory piece. Second is human dignity. I believe, Bill, you made the point about how it's much harder to empower than it is to curtail that autonomy. So how can we advance systems that are going to be bolstering the flourishing of humans? And then finally, and I think most importantly, because nuance is so lost in this discussion, is how do we ensure we have a sector-specific approach to AI? Because what regulation or light touch guardrails work in healthcare may not work in transportation or criminal justice and so on. And so we're seeing states step up in that regard too. There's still a lot to be concerned about. And so I would just, that's something to keep a cautious eye on.
Thank you, David. Just as Bill was going on into avoiding the hard authoritarian elements of AI, the kind of soft authoritarian elements that you've highlighted are just as important for us to grapple with. So thank you so much. Next up in our lineup, I am just delighted to introduce my colleague and steward of tech at the Heritage Foundation, Kara Frederick. Kara is director of the Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation. Her research focuses on emerging technologies and their domestic and geopolitical implications. Like most of our panelists, she could speak on any of these issues we're covering today. However, my job today is to interview her about online censorship and AI. So, Kara, first question for you. Even before we get to AI, let's be clear on what we mean by censorship. Every modern social media company does content moderation. They do this to avoid obscenity, fake posts, and they also do this to tailor your feeds to see things that you agree with, hiding content that it thinks you won't find compelling. Where do you draw the line on what is censorship?
Yeah, good question. And do I need the mic or am I good, everyone? Thumbs up. All right, cool. So I like to refer to a former colleague of mine at Facebook on this question. And he's tweeted out, Alex Stamos of Stanford Internet Observatory fame. He says, content moderation is censorship. You know, he's not somebody who we necessarily align with when it comes to conservative principles, yet he understands that content moderation is censorship. You have certain organizations who say only with the firm, prodigious hand of government, you know, pushing down on these social media companies to police the speech of Americans, that is the only way that we can consider the censorship. But no, Alex Stamos, content moderation is censorship. So I like to refer to his quote for that definition there. But I think what we've seen, and I don't want to, give a speech or whatever. I'm much more interested in what Matt has to say, to be honest. But when it comes to the marketplace of ideas, I think it's very important for everyone here to understand that the marketplace of ideas is on life support. And we've gotten a brief reprieve because of Elon Musk's admittedly ideological stance for free speech in buying X. Let's call it Twitter now. Can we just call it Twitter? All right. But that's not a repeatable solution. I like to say, put not your trust in princes. Yes, we have Elon Musk right now, but he's a singular figure, and we can't depend on that being replicated over and over again. So I firmly believe that took the wind out of the sails on a lot of these Section 230 reform initiatives in Congress, just across the street there. But at the same time, he's like the little Dutch boy, right? He's putting his finger in the dam, and we can't depend on the cavalry coming to save us. He's a singular individual who came up with a very singular solution. So I think it also bears repeating when you look at a genuine marketplace of ideas and what we have or don't have now is I've repeated myself until I'm blue in the face. So everyone who's familiar with the Heritage Foundation's work on big tech, you'll recognize this. But when it comes to censorship and content moderation, this is not distinct to just the digital application layer, right? So when you think of the full digital stack, and again, this is very pedantic, so I'll make it very wavetop, you have layers. One digital application layer, you have mid-tier layers like cloud hosting services, and then you have internet service providers, more foundational layers. This is a very, very dumb way of saying this. This is digital stack for dummies. But all of what we're seeing is censorship at this layer, at this layer, and at this layer. And that is going to be a problem. David Sachs is great when he talks about programming certain things that sit atop our large language models, like a trust and safety layer. When people are plugging into ChatGPT, let's talk about how terrible Biden is. Oh, I cannot do that. Biden is a great person. Let's talk about how wonderful Trump is. Oh, I cannot do that. Very incendiary. That kind of thing. That is the trust and safety layer that is coded by human beings, that is imbued with values, because technology is not neutral, as we've said here before. And as we get into the mid-tier layers, the foundational layers, as we get into the different, dare I say, AI safety mechanisms, I think the information that we're going to be seeing is going to be flattened, is going to be truncated, is going to be severely curtailed, and the flow of information itself is going to be stymied in such a way if these content moderators and these programmers and these companies, frankly, declare it so.
Terrific. Thank you, Kara. Now, the next question tying AI to censorship. What does today's algorithmic censorship look like? And how do our current silencing tools paint a picture for tomorrow's AI censorship? How guilty are living, breathing humans in today's algorithmic censorship? And with emerging AI, are we entering a situation with more human control or less? So comparing today's algorithms to tomorrow's AI algorithms, and the role of humans in censorship.
Yeah, so what I also think it's important to an audience like this to understand is there's not one algorithm to rule them all. When people talk about the algorithm, with a capital A, there's a bevy of internal tools, various algorithms that these companies use to paint some color on it. I'll give you an example. I worked a counterterrorism analysis at Facebook at MPK headquarters in California. And what we did, we helped the trust and safety engineers create these tools to ferret out what we thought would be the likeliest perpetrators of a potential terrorist attack. And I'm talking actual terrorism, not what people are considering terrorism today, according to DHS and February bulletins that say, frankly, conservatives with anti-government or anti-authoritarian ideologies who spread COVID vaccine, 19 misinformation, tantamount to terrorist activity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about legitimate foreign Islamist terrorism, which I went to Facebook to help counter. And we helped create an internal tool that took certain data points of profiles and used them to try to automate that detection of any terrorist actor on the platform who had, say, attempted or could attempt to use the platform for operational planning, which was our worst nightmare, which didn't, to our knowledge, happen during my tenure there. So there are, from soup to nuts, we basically had the idea, I worked with the data scientists and the engineers to create the tool for, I would say, maybe 2 weeks max. Soup to nuts, the tool was created and shipped on the platform and tested on the platform. That is a kind of thing that people would say, oh, the algorithm is, like looking and, tinkering with it. But those are really internal tools that a lot of these big tech companies live and die by. So it really depends on how many internal tools are being built, how many are being shipped, how many are being tinkered with, how many are being used internal to these companies, and then working with specific algorithms as well to potentially police speech of Americans in this instance, and we'll bucket it like that. So I think that is sort of what the landscape looks like, that not many people really understand, because we're thinking, oh, the algorithm, but it's an interaction of a lot of these things that is really occurring behind the scenes to the average American. And then, tomorrow, like I said, it comes down to how these AI safety mechanism, I'll sort of a bucket term, use it, are coded, how they're deployed, how they're tinkered with, how they're iterated on, how they're shipped, what that looks like, which will determine the character and I think the degrees of gradation of the censorship going forward when it comes to AI tools specifically.
Terrific. Well, I put the panel in a hard place, making them do predictions on AI with everything changing so quickly. So, Kara, when we come together for another event in the future on this topic, we're not going to hold you to your answer here, but I'm curious. The conventional wisdom would say as AI proliferates, people are going to be less in control of the censorship regime online. Would you contest that? As AI becomes more baked into our content moderation, our censorship, do you expect people to have more control over this sort of tool or less?
I really think it depends, and it goes back to Bill's comments and the tenor of your comments as well. We always hew toward user empowerment as best as possible. We talk about malicious use cases or applications of AI as a cat and mouse game, and you build one tool and then you build another tool to contend with it. So if companies can live up to the promise of creating tools to empower the user in ways that cleave to the values in our founding documents, dare I say, given to us by God and enshrined in those founding documents, that is the bright spot. That is what I am sanguine about, that people here on this stage or people potentially listening in who are the conservative builders of the future understand that and know that they have to create these tools to contend with what I would say an inertia of having sort of the machine, the content moderators, the AI safetyists that they're building up. So as long as we can offer that particular resistance and build in accordance with that, I think we have a fighting chance. It is it's something that we have to do intentionally. I do think we're behind, but there are people, especially within these big tech companies, that are advocating for something like open sourcing these certain foundation models, which I think are absolutely critical. And I know it's a controversial stance, according to some people, but I think you can dictate the design of these products and ship them to the world and draw the world to yourself by better products, commercially viable products imbued with our values like openness and transparency. And then you're gonna have the AI future that I think everyone on the stage, even the lefty over here, wants. So that is, I believe, the solution. You got to build out of it, as others have said, and you have to make sure that these technologies are embedded, imbued with the values, openness, transparency that have characterized the way that we build for, as long as we've started building in the United States, to a degree. I mean, there's a couple areas we can talk about with the censorship industrial complex and whatnot, but I do believe that we have a chance, and we have to understand that we have a chance, and we have to start now, and that's how you do it.
Thank you so much for your optimism. All right. And finally, it is a real pleasure to welcome Matt Stoller to the program. Matt is the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He is the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, and writes the monopoly-focused newsletter, Big. However, we have Matt on leave from a more important job, being a parent. Matt, congrats on becoming a dad and briefly escaping paternity leave to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, now into the questions. Big tech has treated the recent popularity of AI like a gold rush, stapling AI into virtually every product and service that they have. You have expressed skepticism for this frenzy, alleging anti-competitive behavior masquerading as the democratization of AI. Why do you think that this isn't harmless innovation at work?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and I really enjoyed every single one of your comments. It was really interesting and frustrating because you made me think. You might have even changed my mind a little bit, and I don't like that. So please stop. No, I really I learned a lot. That was great. Okay, so I'm going to answer your question, but I want to give some kind of political context about where we are and why we have these dominant big tech firms. First of all, how many of you think that, there's been like conversation over the last 5-10 years about the power of big tech. How many of you think we've gotten a hold of their power? Like we're kind of push them back in a reasonable way? And there's sort of a, anyone? How many think we haven't? You have not, yeah. Sorry, I'm just being very confusing. It's paternity leave. Okay, so most people had their hands up. Those who didn't probably were just confused by my question. I think we can sort of generally observe without AI, people generally think we don't have a handle on big tech. So I want to get to the title of this forum, which is AI and Human Flourishing, a Pipe Dream question, which is like kind of a crazy title, right? If you just think about it, like we have this technology that can do, you know, presumably, I'm not sold on it, but that can do, you know, bioengineering to cure diseases, that can transform industries in ways that are just unbelievable. And we're like, what a bummer, right? I mean, like I remember the conversation about automating all the jobs, and people were like, what if we could have anything we wanted whenever we wanted it? Oh no, right? Like that, there's something very profoundly weird about our policy discourse, that it's so pessimistic about being able to do new and different and very cool or dystopian things. And I think we have to, and it hasn't always been this pessimistic in America. America has traditionally been a pretty optimistic country. And yet, you know, this is super gloomy about something that could be unbelievable or could be really dystopian. And we have to wonder why that is. It's like a long cry since the Jetsons, right? So I'm going to quote, you quoted Churchill, so I'm going to quote the other great statesman of the 20th century, Mark Zuckerberg. Which is a joke that didn't really make sense, but I liked it anyway. So he said at one point, why did he hire Sheryl Sandberg, who came from Google, but before that came from the Treasury Department? He said, well, he hired her because of her government experience, because he said, quote, Facebook is more like a government than a business. Really, we're setting policy, right? And I think there's sort of an interesting question among conservatives, and I'm going to speculate a little bit here because I'm not a conservative, but why is it that traditionally, like free market conservatives are now weirded out by these immensely successful large tech firms? And it's because they're not businesses, they are private governments. And so the sort of spidey sense, that fear of concentrated power, that's what's going on there. And one of the reasons we're so afraid of this future is because this is a tool that connects all of, it's a supercomputer that all of us carry in our pocket that connects everyone to everyone else. And it could be an amazing tool of liberty, but in fact, it's become a digital leash. And that's a political decision. We made a political decision to do that, so why? Well, I would say it's in response to two revolutions. One of them was political economic in the late 70s, early 80s, and these are bipartisan revolutions, and the other one is a technological revolution that was layered on top of it. So what was that political economic revolution? Well, that was largely in response to a perception of government overreach from the 60s and 70s, a pushback on big government from Carter, Reagan, and I think the Democrats really kind of went along with it too. It was a bipartisan agreement. The government had done too much. And so there was an attempted return to first principles, to a constitution of liberty. And to do that, you know, the conservative movement largely said, we have to get rid of this immense, unfair concentration of government power by breaking it apart. Checks and balances, different branches of government, you could say horizontal and vertical separations, due process, things to get rid of this concentration of power. But there was an exception that both parties liked for different reasons. And that exception was these state-chartered corporations do not have to exist within this Constitution of Liberty. They just have to be, as John put it, efficient. As long as they're efficient, the lodestar, they do not live in this Constitution of Liberty. And I think for a long time, everybody was like, oh, they're private entities. They're not political. They're not part of our political system. And now all of a sudden, this telecommunication revolution happens. You have a whole bunch of consolidation, a bunch of other things that happen. But one day we wake up and we realize there's this whole other system, this extra constitutional system of these private states that live outside of our constitutional order, which traditionally, prior to the 1980s, we would have seen those checks and balances in the private sector as competition. That's how we thought about this Madisonian interpretation. But we wake up and we have Mark Zuckerberg saying, I'm the government, right? And you can't touch me. And so I think it's pretty obvious when we have this extra constitutional system that is actually governing our society, the people, politically, I think you see both sides kind of begging the oligarchs impose my social policies, not the other guys. Like that's with whatever you want, censorship, ESG, climate change, all of these, that's the politics that we're in. But it also creates this pervasive sense of gloom, of learned helplessness, which is why we're saying this an amazing technology is a pipe dream. Or is it I guess it is a pipe dream.
Yes.
So one would, it's pretty obvious that the law is the law, and our political framework is our political framework. So why wouldn't these dominant tech firms control OpenAI or control all of these new forms of technological innovation, if only so that they can control the deployment, slow the deployment if necessary? So I guess I will finish by talking a little bit about why I think AI is it's a very confusing topic, because it's not so much like a product as it is it's not like email or some sort of innovation like that. It's a business method. It can be applied in lots of different sectors. It's a little bit like a wheel, right? You have wheels inside in wheelbarrows, in airplanes, in industrial machinery, and we don't have wheel regulation. Like, we regulate them differently, and that's the way I think about AI. That's the way we should sort of think about it. And so what we are kind of, the fight with big tech, or the collaboration with big tech, is AI policy. That's what we're doing right now. I can get into some of the antitrust things that are going on, but I think we see that kind of across the board right now. So I'm skeptical that there is a democratization of AI, but that's because of this framework where we have an extra constitutional system dedicated solely to efficiency, and then our public policy apparatus live in this very constrained constitution, which is designed to contain them so that they don't impose on our liberty, but have in fact sort of unleashed the tech barons.
Thank you, Matt. You kind of filibustered your way into a more interesting response than the one I was trying to get from. Very much appreciate
yes, no
it.
questions going forward.
Yeah. So while I would try to give you 2 to 3 questions like the other panelists were at the end of your 10 minutes, so we're going to now transition into Q&A. We can always go back to talking more about your content area in Q&A if the audience doesn't have anything, or if the audience would like to ask that themselves. So let's go ahead and transition. And thank you all for bearing through my questions. We are now ready for yours. So raise your hand if you would like to pose a question, and I will direct my colleagues to pass the microphone to you. At a Heritage Tech event, we're not going to treat our virtual attendees as second class. If you have a question, please type it in, and we will include it in the queue. If our audience is silent, like I said, I'm not beneath going back to these other questions I have or booting up ChatGPT. So do we have any questions from the audience to kick off? I think I saw your hand up first, sir.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Is there any reason I can't hold the mic? Thank you. I hear an awful lot of talk about international establishment of guardrails to control AI, particularly with respect to China. And there is zero chance that China will respect any guardrail that we or the United Nations establish. And so I need help understanding this pervasive magical thinking.
I don't know if I'm... Great question. I think it's one that we're all scratching our heads about. My answer is we should try to cripple them as much as we can in AI. And that's a little bit of what we're doing already. So it's true that our export controls on advanced chips are already making them squirm in terms of certain forms of AI, but not all forms. It's really targeting a particular subset, which is an important one, but doesn't target everything, excuse me. The other things we can do, I think the best thing we can do is to siphon off their talent. China produces more AI talent than any other country, and their best talent tends to be educated here and tends to want to stay here and tends to not be able to stay here. Now, we need to be judicious about where they are working, without a doubt. But to my mind, the best way we can boost our own ecosystem and cripple theirs is by siphoning as much talent as we can and placing that talent in strategic areas. I mean strategic here in terms of not national security kind of centered. So those are the two things that I think have the most kind of immediate impact. But I think you're right that I'm very pessimistic about their willingness or even ability to abide by any sort of global rulemaking or what have you.
Can I a couple things? I just want to. It's a very important question. I think in general, not just for AI, weaponized brain drain is one of the kind of least well-utilized strategies the United States can undertake for dealing with our near-peer adversaries. We should have as many Russian and Chinese and Iranian, top quality STEM people in the United States as possible. We don't have to give them clearances and send them to the NSA. But even if they're just teaching math at the University of Nebraska, they're better off here than working on strategic programs in their countries, which is what they will do otherwise. I do think that there is this interesting idealism in certain sectors of kind of, particularly the academic and international law communities about dealing with these technologies through international law. You saw very similar efforts around cyber, very similar efforts around autonomous weapons, which also have gone nowhere. In the case of AI, there's also this ideological element of a number of people vaguely affiliated with a movement called effective altruism, which are concerned that AI are more concerned about the threat of AI itself than about China, and I think are incredibly naive about how international legal frameworks actually operate. Thankfully, in terms of what we're actually doing, we're mostly doing things like chip controls. I will say there is one thing we ought to consider, which is as we integrate AI into military command and control systems, it will be prudent to deconflict those and to not get in an unnecessary arms race with our adversaries, because it could lead to catastrophe for everyone. And there's precedent here during the nuclear age, right? We realized after the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually, Moscow and Washington have to be able to talk to each other. We have to have protocols. We have to have ways of not unintentionally destroying the world. And as AI, one of the things AI is going to do in military operations is speed up decision cycles, but also in not just necessarily in an intentional way, right? In a competitive way. If you don't act more quickly than your opponent, you will lose the ability to act. But this could lead to worse off outcomes for everyone. And so I do think there will be room for bilateral or trilateral negotiations about command and control systems, but we're still a long ways from understanding what that's going to look like.
Can I offer an answer? I'll try to be quick. I always wanted to tell you what's behind the magical thinking. A couple weeks ago, Xi Jinping was in San Francisco and gave a speech to every big tech, lots of big tech leaders, lots of private equity barons, Wall Street guys, who all gave him a standing ovation. So that's why they want guardrails and a framework and blah, 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 blah. So you want to deal with China, which I think is an important and dangerous threat. We got to break big tech. We got to get control of the private corporations that are aligned with China here.
Okay, woman in the beige sweater, I saw your hand next.
Thank you so much. I'm Kelsey Frierson. I'm a technology fellow with Senator Thune. And I really appreciate the kind of different angles that we've talked about with AI today. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about kind of in my role in Congress right now is this kind of sector-specific hub and spoke model of AI oversight. In order to do that, I've also been trying to do kind of a gap analysis of, do these sector-specific regulators need additional authority to regulate AI? I'm really curious. I don't know who on the panel would probably be best set to answer that, but just curious what your thoughts are and if it makes more sense to have some sort of like centralized hub that addresses those gaps as opposed to empowering each sector-specific regulator and writing additional authorities for them.
I can take a first stab. So from a state level, the model tends to be Office of Attorney General, and I think as a deceptive trade practice, enforcing it that way is consistent, clear, and generally results in pretty strong enforcement. The model I tend to look at is with cybersecurity for critical infrastructure at the national level. So there's such massive siloing that's happened, DHS for different sectors, Department of Energy, and so on. And as Washington does, the cloistering, stovepiping takes over, and that prevents the sharing of information that could be actionable intelligence. So the instinct to say new agency, that's not what I'm saying, but that partnerships, if it is going to be a multi-agency approach, needs to be baked in and established on the front end so they can learn from respective enforcement agencies and so on. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if someone else from the national perspective wants to touch on that.
Any takers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just need more. You need more authority from states. You need more authority from government agencies, but it also has to be very specific because it can't be unbounded, or else they'll be like both tyrannical and they'll do nothing. But I think one of the problems that we have is there's this sort of desire in Congress and kind of in a lot of these conversations to say, like, we need to really look at seating charts. That's really important to figure out, like, if we need a new seating chart. And that's because Congress couldn't even ban TikTok, right? And it's like, do we need a new seating agency? Like, maybe. Do we need to ban TikTok? Yeah, right? And so in a lot of ways, when I'm looking at like AI policy as it's being developed now, you have a bunch of regulators, you have states that are litigating, you have antitrust cases that are impacting the real world deployment of AI, because AI is not new. And it's like, okay, Trump brought the investigation of Google in 2019, it brought a case in 2020, it's 2023, the trial just happened, the judge is going to rule some point in 2024, maybe it'll get appealed, and it'll all get done in 2025, 2026. We can't, that's crazy. Like, that's just crazy. There needs to be much, much, much faster ability for public officials and for private litigants. You don't trust government, give it to private litigants, right? To go after unfair, deceptive practices, things that are, I think we would all agree, are immoral. And so in that sense, I would say you need more and you need tighter rules, but I wouldn't get tripped up in the idea of just let's figure out more seating charts and more bureaucracy. That's what a lot of people really love to do. I'm a Democrat, we love that, but like, I think we need to be very clear about the problem you're trying to solve, the authority to solve it, and make it quick and effective.
Well, and I also think we have an opportunity here to get after a lot of these things before we have to retroactively try to get privacy legislation passed or something like that. So we have the opportunity now with AI to help nudge, I would say, from, with the sticks that you guys have, to nudge these companies to develop privacy-enhancing technologies, approaches to machine learning, like federated models of machine learning, like instituting digital privacy, that are not going to have, these onerous regulatory regimes, have to come in on the back end and then, fight in 117th, fight in 118th Congress, fight in 119th Congress, and then ultimately not get anything done. So let's go and let's have these ideas seated within the companies, and if you need to shake a stick at them with your big stick, shake a stick at them and get privacy by design instituted in the building phase, the design phase of what the products these companies are creating. There are NIST has standards for privacy that can go a long way. You can enshrine biometric data, which AI-driven technologies like facial recognition make extensive use of, as sensitive data with those specific specific strictures that NIST has already laid out for us and enumerated very, very clearly. So I think it's very important for us, for everyone in these rooms, for everyone staffing the offices across the way, to understand that we're at the ground floor of this. We're in the shaping phase of this, and in order to prevent down the line all of these fights in Congress that are intractable, that don't tend to result in much, we can fix that right now. We can front load that. So that is my plug for privacy enhancing technologies, and getting into the decision cycles of these companies right now. I think we're at a critical time, and we're saving ourselves a lot. We're saving us a lot of pain in the future if we don't do it, or if we do it now.
Imagine if we'd gotten ahead of social media like we want to do with AI. Be a different world. Like I said, we're not going to ignore our online audience. Do we have any questions from them?
One question that came in was with regard to the concerns over the harms of AI and the need for additional gatekeeping. So there's a lot of arguments that specifically large language models should be closed source. And some are arguing, for the sake of transparency, we should have open sourced LLMs. And the question to the panel is, which of those should we prefer generally, and which of those should policy sort of push towards?
Thank you. Hey, Carrie, you gave a green light to open source matters. Would you like to start?
Yeah, of course. And the people who are better on this, I sort of formulated my own ideas and then realized that much smarter programmers already came to those conclusions. So I congratulated myself. So I would look at Andrew Ng's work. Jan LeCun is more of Matt's persuasion, but I think he has a lot of good things to say on this front. At the Center for New American Security, we had OpenAI on our AI task force starting in 2017, 2018, and when they were releasing smaller elements of GPT-2, that was sort of a great vignette. I think we like to advertise, because you had the open source community able to identify some potential malicious use cases of this very powerful, risky model, as we called it back then, and fix it. So I still think that the general contours of that argument are the best, and Andrew Ng fills in the details better than I could from this stage. But it's in imbuing technology with our values, like openness, not like the generative AI draft rules coming out of the CCP that say, these large language models have to adhere to core socialist values. No, offer our own affirmative agenda for these products instead, and you are, again, going to draw the world to ourselves. People, I like to call them swing states, right? In Brazil, in India, those important areas, they're going to want to use our products and not necessarily the products of the CCP, as they're upholding their core socialist values. The open source community can help with that. And then there's an argument that if you open source these models, we're going to lose the competition with China. Sorry, guys, but like you've seen in cybersecurity, they've been in our systems. They're probing our systems for years. If we don't think that they're going to get our closed models, they're going to get our closed models. I shoulder to shoulder with people at Facebook who, everybody else without that geopolitical cognition was kind of walking around like, oh, that's just Joe. But I'm like, Joe's got something going on here. So they're almost going to get it anyway. So let's make sure that we can have the best product imbued with our values, which I think we should not shy away from making value judgments about. Our values are better. Our American values are better than CCP's values. So let's build products in accordance with those and try to get the rest of the world to use them.
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, and it's really about the shape of the future of this technology and of our civilization. Because the reason is, if you move towards closed foundation models, then the regulatory approach is to regulate a small number. It's the big tech approach. We're gonna coerce a small number of very large corporations. They have a lot to lose because they have giant monopoly revenues coming in. Because in a closed model, everyone who's building on top of these systems is paying a little rent to the foundation model to make it work, right? So it has a completely different political economy. And with open source models, you have everyday Americans using their freedom of association, freedom of commerce to build products, competitive products for the marketplace on top of these large open models, right? And then the foundations are transparent. They can build models and products and systems that for the communities that they actually are a part of. They can't be centrally controlled, because another benefit of a closed system is central control, right? We can force, it's not inconceivable if you have 3 or 4 foundation models, which in a closed system you would, that the government, or not even the government, right, as we've seen, could coerce them to overnight change the definition of a word, change the definition of a term, stop performing, turn off the API for certain users. So if this, Kara earlier mentioned the technology stack, right? You have platforms like Facebook, but they're built on top of server infrastructure like AWS, Cloudflare, payments providers like Stripe, et cetera. Many technologists believe that AI is going to basically replace, like a single source, replace a huge layer of this technology stack. Imagine being able to turn off the internet for your political enemies. So I think it's absolutely critical that we preserve open source AI for our future.
I mean, also think about it, like one of our advantage over China is when they invent something cool, they tend to like put their scientists in jail.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the openness is not just important, it's not just important strategically, it's also a return to a traditional American values. Because if you look at a whole bunch of consent decrees in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s of dominant firms like AT&T, like IBM, the top firms that said you cannot, we shouldn't lock ourselves out of our own technology. And that means we have to revisit IP, patents, copyright, trade secrets law. The Chinese get everything. So all this stuff does, it has economic effects, but one of the things this stuff does is it says Americans can't work on American technology, but the Chinese can innovate on top of our technology we're locking ourselves out of, which strategically doesn't make any sense. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, when we had a lot of consent decrees, I said 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, back then. You had like the AT&T had to license its patents on a non-discriminatory basis on things like the electronic transistor or the laser or all sorts of other tools and technologies that created Silicon Valley, right? So it's really important to recognize that this innovation and openness works to America's favor, and it doesn't actually work. And when we aren't open, when we're closed, when we have these monopolists taking these rents, controlling the deployment of technology, it's bad for us, it's good for China.
Just to add one slightly different perspective, I think I agree with most of what's been said. An interesting fact is that on the international stage, China has been pushing for more open source. And the logic there, from their side, seems to be that they know that they're behind on a lot of these foundation models. And so the hope is that it can kind of help their ecosystem. I think a lot of the people who are worried about future foundation models are worried that they could kind of get to a point where they could hold the hand of a bioterrorist and create some sort of super weapon. The interesting thing there, though, is, you can go 2 ways when you face that problem. 1, you could try to close down the models. 2, you could try to develop safety mechanisms in building the models that are more robust than what we have now. And so I think a lot of times we have to recognize that, first of all, that risk is not really materialized yet, and a lot of people talk like it is. But at the same time, it could materialize, among other risks. And so when we think about these questions, we do need to think carefully. At the same time, I should also say the CCP is pushing for open source, and our flirting with more closed source is also allowing them to kind of accuse us of wanting to hoard the benefits. So it's a complex, multi-layered issue. I think that we need more research also in how to curb, basically how to more robustly curb potential dangers from models if and when they arise in the models themselves.
Thank you, Bill. I think we have time for one more question. So go ahead and raise your hands if you'd like to give one. Yes, sir.
Going to your title, the AI versus human flourishing. If now with AI, it's like crime has DNA, where is the copyright on if someone put all their material in, it like showed someone else was using it for years, people didn't know the truth. How is AI being set up judicially more to be used in that side, like enforcement, where China wants it, the government has all the power. Here, you're basically under your creator first before you're under your government. For that freedom, does that work as a question?
Yeah, so for your question, you're asking about ownership of biometric information and governance with that?
Content more. Is it copyright on someone like encouraged? So if someone, a writer put in all their material and then it showed that people had been using it without credit, or whether just historically for forensically showing all this ties together, if it can do that and show all the strings attached, is that the human side versus the AI side? How do you have it be the human side is celebrated?
Thank you for your question. Would anyone like to address this? Yeah, please, David.
It's a very multifaceted landscape. I was talking to someone at Adobe a few days ago, and Adobe is kind of following Microsoft in assuming all the liability in the instance where someone's creative work is used to create something new with a generative AI model. If there is a successful lawsuit, then those companies would assume that liability. But and I say it's multifaceted because not every company is treating it the same. And the training of LLMs, large language models, on those creative works, as a data privacy guy, a lot of it isn't necessarily clear until there's different tools you can go access online to see what books have trained what different models. And authors were learning for the first time their books were used to train those models. So on the just pure creative side, you're seeing companies recognize we want to promote that innovation, we want to promote creativity, so we're going to take that legal liability, but in kind of the more, I don't want to say covert, but less obvious sense of just the training of how a ChatGPT might respond, that is definitely not as transparent and clear. And I think, we've hit on it a couple of times now, but the whole legal landscape, you're going to see a lot of lawsuits. The courts are going to handle a lot of questions here, and where we can apply pre-existing precedent and law, we're going to see how that all plays out, whether we're talking Section 230 or any of the other myriad federal precedents in place here. And that will, I think, be a big defining factor in the AI policy space in the next year.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the copyright and issues are really important to get right. The IP issues. I mean, I think it is clear that, for training these models, something like fair use has to apply. There's too much value at stake relative to, the marginal value of somebody's Harry Potter fan fiction having made it into a training corpus for OpenAI. Interestingly enough, once this ecosystem is off the ground, though, it actually makes assigning credit for kind of influence or derivation easier. Shout out to my friend John Stokes, a long time ago founded Ars Technica. He's working on a AI startup called Symbolic.ai. It's aimed at journalists and media professionals. One of the interesting things is when you train these models, right, each of those contributions, like a book that you'd written, it's called tokenized. It gets interpreted in a way that you can then run machine learning algorithms on top of it. In principle, you can actually derive which tokens were most important to producing some other derivative work. So you could move to an ecosystem where if you're an artist or a musician or a writer, you're actually getting royalty revenues or licensing revenues based on work that others created. If the system determined that your token was very important to the content that ended up being created in the generative system. So there are some actually very interesting possibilities in looking down in the kind of 10, 20-year landscape.
Thank you, John. Now, looking at the clock, I believe that this is the appropriate moment to wind down the program before lunch gets cold. But before we do that, I would like to ask the panelists to provide any closing thoughts. And I think we have time for roughly 60 seconds each if you'd like to use it. So, John, would you kick us off?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about Kelsey's question about authorities. I'm struck with the most important thing I think that worries me about how our system of government is approaching AI is in our administrative state, our Congress, our executive branch, they don't actually human flourishing does not appear on the policy landscape. Safety does, efficiency does, sometimes political cost. But I don't know how we survive this transition if we don't find a way to imbue human flourishing, the human person, the common good, with serious weight in how we decide some of these questions.
Yeah, just a quick note. I think that the CCP, China represents a huge threat to human flourishing with AI. But the most important thing that we need to do is to get these questions we've been talking about right. And once we have a model, and America is uniquely positioned to build that model due to the strength of our ecosystem and our founding values, we can help to lead that for the rest of the world. And if we don't come to agreements and consensus on how to create AI in a way that encourages human flourishing, we're leaving the rest of the world to China, and that will come back to us.
I'll be quick. With how easy it is to catastrophize on AI, I just want to highlight that data privacy should be at the core of responsible AI solutions. So this is to anyone who is a staffer for a member here, the American Data Privacy Protection Act and other similar data privacy laws. Getting those right ensures that there's consumer agency and more trust and really just empowering the consumer at the front end. So I'm optimistic. We're seeing good progress there. Get that right, we're in the right direction.
Yeah, you talk about agency, you talk about human flourishing. I think the best way to do that is to give individual Americans, family units, access to this technology. And that is not restricting it to, say, those big 5 tech companies that have the natural advantages when it comes to AI, throwing GPUs at the problem, their compute resources, the high volume and variety of data that they've been collecting on us for years and years and years. Regulatory capture is real, and you can't let these big tech companies dictate the future of these technologies. You have to empower, I wouldn't say the consumer, although it is a consumer, but you have to empower the American individual, the American family. You have to give them access to the GPUs, like our friend James Poulos has said, and access to a slate of digital rights that are going to encompass artificial intelligence and the development, deployment, and use of these technologies. So they shouldn't just be dictated by these big tech companies. They should be available to the individual American, and they should be imbued with the values that make this country so great and allow us to even talk about giving and decentralizing these technologies in general.
So I'm going to just one note of optimism and then one challenge to conservatives. So the note of optimism is yesterday, a San Francisco jury in the heart of big tech country decided with just a few hours deliberation that Google has been monopolizing the Android App Store. It's the first antitrust loss for big tech ever, not the last. So the people, the public, if you think of a jury as a kind of quasi-poll, are kind of with the notion that we need to control these dominant firms somehow. So that's a note of optimism. People don't want a pipe dream. They want human flourishing, right? The second thing, a challenge for the conservative movement is we have an administrative state. It's either going to be in the hands of dominant firms or it's going to be in the hands of public officials at a federal and state level who are empowered as well as private litigants. And there needs to be some real hard thinking from conservatives about what that administrative state should look like. Because if there isn't, and the trends keep on going the way they are in Congress and in the judiciary, then we're going to rely on the Facebook Election Commission instead of other forms of managing our society.
Well, hey, let's give it up for our panel. On behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I'd like to express our appreciation to the speakers, the attendees, our Big Tech campaign, and everyone involved in making today's panel a success, especially our tremendous events staff. Safe travels to you all. We look forward to connecting with you again. Have a Merry Christmas.